Good afternoon. It's my big pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to organizers for inviting me to give this talk. In the next 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, I would like to tell you about my book project that I just completed after years of research, and I am glad that it's found its shape. Even though, as probably you all know, and I am registering even more every day, there are so many topics that one could still work on in terms of Kafka and Kafka-Rezeption, and it is really surprising given to how much has been written already, to the effect that already in the 1960s, Czech theater critic and director Jan Grossman commented with some warning, "We all know what Kafkism means," and this was 1964. So it's interesting that more than 50 years later, we are still debating what does it mean Kafkaesque, what is Kafkism, what Kafkismus, what Kafkarna is, and all these different terms. And I hear people, I had an opportunity to attend some discussions in the last few weeks, and I heard a number of scholars and teachers and writers, and they were so engaged in debating these questions as if it was the freshest topic on the earth. So that's, in some way, it's very interesting for me. I also would like to say that, so I came from Boston a couple weeks ago to Prague, and there wasn't any commemoration of Kafka's centenary in Boston except for one by Goethe Institute, and they invited only Czech speakers, which was also very interesting, but and an American translator. But it's interesting but of course logical to realize that Kafka is much more alive in a way here in our space of Central Europe. So I will talk specifically about my discipline of Kafka in Czechoslovakia. At some point in my research, I came across an article which by a Germanist in England who wrote that there are different receptions on the two sides of the Iron Curtain, now talking about the Cold War or communism period. So I really work on 1948 through 1989, just to sort of like limit the scope. So she commented, "For if Kundera correctly summed up the collective sense in the East that their world was stiflingly Kafkan, approaches to Kafka's work in the West were significantly more plural, as Marxist, existentialist, and structuralist readings, to name but a few, abounded." So this caught my attention, and I was curious to explore whether I would agree with this reductive reading. And my book that will come out next year claims that this is not true, that in Czechoslovakia we had all these types of readings, existentialist, structuralist readings, and Marxist readings, but we also had psychoanalytical readings, but we also had some uniquely specific Czech readings that I believe contributed to the array of interpretations of Kafka more broadly. So I will talk a little bit about that. One of my arguments, which was also something that goes against the more common narrative of Kafka in Czechoslovakia, is that although there were disruptions in the reception of the author, more importantly, there were continuities. And by the common narrative, and I am referring to sort of scholarship, mostly outside of Czechoslovakia, but even within Czechoslovakia, who simply map out the reception of Kafka onto a political map, saying that whenever the regime was more strict, the Kafka was banned, and this is just as if nothing happened. And so the reception follows this curve of being banned after 1948, and then in the late 1950s, during the political thaw, suddenly there was some Kafka was more visible. And then in 1963 was the famous Liblice conference in Czechoslovakia, which opened up in those conventional readings, opened up the space for Kafka being published and discussed publicly in the official realm. And then again, after 1968, with the Soviet-led invasion to Czechoslovakia, the door sort of closed down. And again, we had a huge disruption until 1989. So this is the kind of common assumption about the history of the reading of Kafka. So I argue, by contrast, that that Kafka never disappeared from the literary and social realm. And even I would say that in those years when he was not published officially, he was received in a very dynamic and in a very interesting way by the readers. And that's true also for some of the interpretations. So I start with the mediators, specifically Paul Eisner, who was Kafka's contemporary. So that argument is that Czechs needed someone to mediate Kafka to them, and he was a figure of that early mediation. And he felt he understood Kafka through sharing his space in Prague. And Eisner, very well known, responded by criticizing the Western interpreters for not understanding where Kafka came from. And he even argued that we cannot understand Kafka without that kind of social, linguistic, religious context from which he came. I knew that this concept or this thesis existed from the late 1920s and was important in the 1930s and also in the 1940s in Eisner's writings, and in also it was a topos sort of like where formed the ambience for that kind of reception of Prague German Jewish authors. But what I was surprised was to find out that this kind of reading continued through the 1960s. That, for example, in 1963, in the leading paper at the Liblice conference, Eduard Goldsticker used Eisner's concept of the triple ghetto, only he transformed it to sort of more Marxist categories. So instead of religious ghetto, because at that time the word Jew it was not possible to acknowledge Kafka as a Jewish writer in official Czechoslovakia. So throughout his long paper in 1963, he never mentions his Jewish origin in Prague, but so he substitutes this angle by kind of late bourgeois capitalist economy. And so Goldsticker places Kafka into the ghetto, but this ghetto, it's a very figurative term. Already in Eisner's times, there was no ghetto, of course. But he places, so Goldsticker kind of transforms it, talking about the nationalistic, and the linguistic, and the economic ghetto. And then again, so this concept really reverberated through many, many reviews and articles. I mean, many, we talk about dozens, a few dozens that were published, even into, like, let's say, the 1980s. Let's say Claudio Magris, the Italian bohemist who wrote about Prague, very much bases his interpretation or his understanding of Prague German literature on Eisner's concept, even though it became such a common trope that usually Eisner is not acknowledged by name. It just became a kind of interpretive tool that seemed to be shared by many different writers. It traveled as far as Deleuze and Guattari's 1975 very influential book, Kafka for the Minor Literature, which also surprised me that it has so much from that original topos of Kafka as living in some kind of impoverished environment, impoverished culturally, impoverished linguistically, impoverished nationally, and that his German was like Papiernes Deutsch, a concept that already existed in Fritz Mautner previously, and Deleuze and Guattari, without actually knowing much about the Czech or Czechoslovak context, used these kind of concepts to characterize his writing as the model of minor literature, but I will leave that besides. So that's for the continuities. And I will zoom in today from all that material to two of the strains that I identify as specific original readings. I will first go over which ones these are. So in addition to Eisner's ghetto, then I talk about Kafka and the old Prague, in parentheses, because it's a construct of old Prague, to which certain interpreters started placing Kafka in the 1950s. And both Czech authors and let's say West German writers, French writers who started coming to Czechoslovakia in search of Kafka. I will talk a little bit about some early figures of Kafka's reception for whom Kafka was a real discovery. So this is mostly 1940s and 1950s. I will skip the Marxist interpretations, but lastly, I will talk about the latest phase of the 1970s and 1980s, where several important intellectuals and writers wrote about Kafka while in prison in Czechoslovakia. Just to a little background too, because most of the actual reception is what we would call in the unofficial sphere, works that were not published or articles that were not published. But just for a little taste of what was the official doctrine about Kafka, I present here just a little snippet of a very long memoir by the President Novotný, which was recorded in the early 1970s after he was no longer a president. And the memoir was published, but only partly. And so this section is from a part that wasn't published, and the President Novotný, who, as you know, was a very conservative and very orthodox communist leader, he commented a lot about Kafka in Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, and he, I'm sorry, it's barely visible, and it's in Czech, so I'll just summarize. He said, well, we were never interested in Kafka, in the author, that even the Masaryk Czechoslovakia was not interested in because he was not readable. And we were wondering why why he picked such a large interest. And he explains that he wanted to ban the Kafka conference, but Jan Hendrich, one of the figures, he was, I think, Minister of Culture, he argued that if we ban it, it will not be viewed favorably by the West, so let's have the conference proceed, and we can always stop it. Yeah, so after the conference, and after 1968, when the normalization regime came, Novotný commented, the Kafka conference was really the start of the revisionist attempt of the counter-revolution in Czechoslovakia. And because of the Kafka conference, the economy suffered. And basically, he blamed the Kafka conference and Kafka on the poor economy in the 1960s and all the the whole 1968 movement, which is somewhat curious and interesting, but it's good to know, like, what was the official stand throughout 60s, really. So I will talk now about a very interesting writer and translator, Emmanuel Fra, who is not as well known as he deserves, I believe. He discovered Kafka's works. So he was born in 1919, and he discovered Kafka's works in one Prague's antiquariat, second-hand bookshop in the 1940s, which is true for many Czech writers and intellectuals, that they discovered Kafka in one of the second-hand bookstores. And he was intrigued and started exploring Kafka's Prague by walking to sites connected to the author. He noted, so he wasn't overly deterministic in saying, in that he differed from Eisner, I believe. He didn't say, okay, we must understand Prague to understand Kafka, because, as you know, people across the globe read Kafka and don't need to know Czech or understand much about Prague. So Fra still wasn't, he wasn't saying, like Eisner, you must know Prague to understand Kafka, but for him it was extremely important and interesting to start discovering places connected to the author. Most of my information comes from little snippets of memory by the theater director Ivan Vyskočil, who remembered Fra at the time, and he described how Fra was keeping a scrapbook, just having a notebook into which he Vyskočil called it skládanka, like a folding picture book, and in which he recorded his walks, in which he quoted from Kafka's works. He added his own photographs. He glued in archival photos from the old town. And his own comments. So it was a kind of interesting collage, I believe. Unfortunately, I don't think that collage survived. I tried to find it, and I wasn't successful. It would be a wonderful discovery if it existed in that original form. I think it very much corresponds to the aesthetics of collage and the group 42, which Fra didn't quite belong to as one of the people, but was very close to, with Jiří Kolář and other writers and artists. And that kind of interest in the city and in images and in writing. What happened is that in the 1950s, Jan Lukas, who was a foremost modernist Czech photographer, so Lukas joined him on these walks through Prague and started creating his own photos that were eventually published in this publication. So Lukas was the one who arranged for the publication of Frinta's essay. So I believe it's not the exact same form that was in the original collage, but Frinta wrote an essay based on all his explorations, and Lukas added his photographs. And this book, which was called Franz Kafka Lebte in Prague, was published in 1960 by the Czechoslovak publishing house Artia. That was a state publishing house for export. So the books published there were only in foreign languages. It started as so Artia started not only as a publishing house, but as an export agency. They also translated Czech literature to foreign languages, but the books were not available in Czechoslovakia. It was published in German and in English, and 2 years later in French, but the Czech edition only came out in 2000. So this is one example of a really very, very delayed, a very big gap between, in that reception. I think that this is the first type of a book that became later quite popular, a book that connects Kafka to Prague through these kind of walks and textual walks and images. And it's a large format publication, really a beautiful book, a kind of coffee table book. And it created a kind of model for a number of other similar titles that were published from the 1960s through the 1980s. So there was a book by, like later on, let's say by Jiří Gruša, that you may know from 1984, but there were some earlier books that really kind of have a very similar concept of text, new images, archival images, quotations from Kafka's works, kind of juxtaposed. So for me, this is an example, like Frinta's writing is an example of a very early enthusiast. And it helped me to understand what it must have been like when someone really discovered Kafka for the first time. He discovered him as an unknown author. And so through Kafka's work, it helped me most maybe to imagine what kind of fascination of a poet it would have been to be encountering Franz Kafka for the first time. This book cover is quite special and important in the Czech context. It is the first edition of The Castle in 1935 in Paul Eisner's translation. It is so it kind of like precedes Frinta, but it is, I switch to this now because I will talk briefly about another type of reception of the artists and writers who were engaging with surrealism and existentialism, but really overcame it by, let's say, the late 1940s, by early 1950s. And talking about that early fascination, so we have the very well-known artist Mikuláš Medek, who, okay, I will read to you how in the testimony of Petr Král, the poet Petr Král, how Medek experienced Kafka in the early 1950s. He thought with his entire body and mainly with his nerves, which are directly connected to the imagination. And he never reacted to anything in a banal way, just as he said that when he read Kafka's Trial, he got fever for 3 days. And in the same spontaneous way, he spoke about all his experiences in a way that cut into the nerves of whoever listened to it. And I sort of read or found examples of that kind of early fascination with Kafka exactly in the correspondence between Medek and the translator and artist Zbigněk Sekal. So I will read to you an example of that. So Zbigněk Sekal was an important sculptor, but he was also a translator. His translations of Kafka came out in the late 1950s and in 1963. Early 1960s. So in his diary, he wrote, "I'm translating Investigations of a Dog. Sometimes I'm so captivated by it that I no longer distinguish what comes from there and what comes from me. So closely do I identify with it. Kafka's way out is absolute. It is the only possibility in a very precise way, the only way out, and the only possible way out. That is, one can live that way." And there are numerous passages in his letters and in his diaries where he describes how directly he approached Kafka at that time and how directly he identified with his writings. So this is something that is typical for the 1950s, whether it is sort of like walking Kafka streets or whether it is identifying with the work through translation. It is not something that we can observe in the 1970s and 1980s. Identification still exists there, but as I will show in a rather different way. So I think I have one more quotation from Sekal to Medek, and this is Medek's painting, a portrait of Sekal. So he wrote to Medek about Kafka's works. "These diaries and the entire volume are amazing. I am eager for you to read it. I don't want to influence you, but I would recommend the same order in which I read him. That is, The Castle, that you already know, America, The Trial, the prose, and only then the diaries. The volume of prose was a good place to start, but then you should start one of the novels that you don't know." Yeah. So this is such a, like reading it much later on, it's such an innocent approach to Kafka, as it seems to us, really like, reading a very unknown author, unknown works. This is this is actually Sekal's, so this book cover is Sekal's design and book cover for the Metamorphosis or Proměna in 1963. I will skip maybe this, references to the 1960s, because to me this is such a rich era when Kafka was allowed to be published after 1963, that we have so many intertextual and intermediate relationships that would really require another monograph just to focus on the work of the, let's say, Věra Linhartová, the prose writer, or the artist Karel Nepráš, or the filmmaker Pavel Juráček, just to name a few. So I really just completely skipped that because I think I don't do this kind of intertextuality in this book. But I want to move on to a quotation from the diaries by Jan Zábrana that you may have read before. So Jan Zábrana was an important translator who published who maintained diaries, as many authors who were not published officially. His diaries were only published in the 1990s. And I will read to you from an entry from 1981. So for the young, non-conforming Prague intellectuals of the 1950s who skulked around the literary scene or who themselves wrote, it was common for each of them to have a couple of Franz Kafka's short stories at home, which they had translated themselves and which they lent to friends and acquaintances or read them out at get-togethers. It was somehow the done thing. I heard and saw several stories in perhaps 20 handwritten translations during the rounds. Where did all these cobbled together translations disappear to? So the Czech there is usmolené, like literally like soiled. Yeah, but it also has the allusion to, that someone labored hard on those translations. They were an expression, a reflection of the longing for the knowledge of the forbidden, outlawed world of true writing, which Kafka at the time embodied for them. That it was only a couple of stories, 1, 2, 3, never a whole book, was simply evidence of the authentic love of amateurs rather than of superficiality. They were not professionals. They were not capable of more, had not the staying power. They were mostly timid lovers of an illusion which Franz Kafka embodied for them at the time. My memories of those evenings when somebody somewhere would read out Kafka's stories are filled with great melancholy. All of these stories were later published in book form, making sure that it could never be the same again. So there is a little contradiction because he says like what happened to them and then he says they were published. So I did some research in the Samizdat library in Prague. There are very few of these like single sheet copies of the translations from that time, but we know about a few of those translators. I already mentioned Eisner and Sekal and Frinta, who didn't exactly translate the whole pieces, but parts. Jan Rychlík, who was a musical composer, but also translated Kafka. The writer Jan Hansch translated The Trial in the 1950s, which was never published, but he also translated Der Bau and Forschungen eines Hundes. And Bohuslava Gregerová, an important translator, published stories from the collection Der Landarzt. And if you were in Prague, or if you get to Prague, to the new Museum of Czech Literature, there is an exhibition on Kafka at the moment, which has facsimiles of her translations from the 1950s. So I will talk a little bit about those. So Josef Hirschel and Bohuslava Gregerová were both important translators from mostly German, also poets, and in their very massive memoir, which was published first in Samizdat and then in 2007, there are parts about exactly exchanging the translation, the text by Kafka. So the male narrator writes, "Once again, I opened to you a little bit my secret kingdom and led you from tree to tree through my paradise. And it is not only my paradise. Already for several years, we have wandered around with our closest friends, Klima, Demel, Weiner, a trio that does not cease to interest us, our damned, our unofficial, but all the more real avant-garde. Although Hellas remains in our heart. And above it all hovers the demon of Franz Kafka, whose volumes in their first editions I got sometime in 1946 from the manager of the Petr second-hand bookstore. Partly I lent out the treasure, partly I gifted it. And for you, the gray, untidily bound Landarzt is left." And then there is the female narrator's entry. commenting. You gave me the collection of short stories by Franz Kafka, Einlandarts, the edition from 1919. I have already read the Czech translation of his Castle, which was the book cover that I showed before. But it didn't move me. But now the impact is almost painful. And what's more, Kafka from your hand. I don't understand you or myself enough, but I have to do something that has to do with the two of us. More than just reading and putting away. It forces me to get deeper into the text. So I'm starting diligently and laboriously, but without restraint or hesitation, to translate individual stories. So she was a young translator at the time, and she writes elsewhere in this memoir that her first translation, and it's Kafka, and how hard it is for her to work on these translations. So of course, to us, we can't not remember Milena Jesenska's correspondence with Kafka about her translation of The Stalker and their exchange about her translations, which I think really creates a kind of parallel, because the translation here becomes almost like a vehicle of a new romantic relationship between a translator and a male counterpart. And I think even that material, I think, would be a nice, article. And it's interesting that as other pieces that I quote here from, it really, surprisingly enough, we don't have much secondary literature on these sources. So just one more quote. You brought me translations of Kafka's stories, The Country Doctor, A Dream, A Fratricide, 11 Sons, The Cares of a Family Man, A Visit to a Mine, and Before the Law. I know that you made them first of all for yourself and for me, but they circled among several along with the proofs of Preutz's translation of America, which Peter didn't manage to publish in 1948, along with Hansch's translation of The Burrow and Richlich's translation of the story The Rejection. Your translation of the opening story, in which the heads of horses peek into the windows and worms swarm in an open wound, inspired me to write a text about a father who rises from the dead and turns into a boy with threatening eyes. And there are a few such very potent and rich testimonies of that kind of circulations and translations during the 1950s. I think I have maybe in the last 5 or 10 minutes that I have, I would like to move just for a kind of comparison to the 1970s and to show you how, and 1980s, to show you how different the reception of Kafka was by then. On a couple of examples. In 1983, the world celebrated Kafka's centenary, the centenary from his birth. There wasn't much going on. There was like one single event organized in Prague by the Jewish community. But I like this photograph. I hope you can see it at least a little bit. It shows the 1966 bust of Kafka on his birthhouse, and it has this marking in chalk, Stolet, 100 years, and few flowers. So it's a very rare image. I only found this one image from that era. But to talk about that moment is to talk briefly about Urana Shova, who was a sociologist, not working in her profession at the time, but very important for distribution of exilic and samizdat literature, exilic literature to Czechoslovakia, and samizdat literature to the sort of like tamizdat publishing houses outside of Czechoslovakia. And she was arrested for this activity, and on November 8, 1981, she wrote from the Ruzyně prison. Dear friends, I apologize for urging you to undertake a task and reminding you what you ought to be doing while I am lazing about here in prison. I have remembered that in July 1983, we will be commemorating the 100th anniversary of Franz Kafka's birth. It will also be 20 years since the Kafka conference at Liblice, where the renewal process is said to have started. You haven't forgotten. And then she urges, later in the letter, it's a long letter which was smuggled out of the prison through her lawyer, and it was published in West Germany in a little booklet that commemorated Kafka's centenary just by, this kind of special material, this prison letter of Šiklova. In her letter, she continues, how many land surveyors' cars have I met since I have been here? How many Josef's cars trying to discover why they were summoned, why they were indicted, what they did wrong, and why nobody talks to them. These latter-day Ruzině cars write, appeal, write, and write again, all in vain. And I quote this to exemplify a very different approach to Kafka in her writing and the writing of other dissidents at the time, who, after Kafka's works became very popular and very widely received in the 1960s, they didn't have to explain, and they didn't do this kind of direct identifications, or they were not talking about some kind of fascination, but they were accepting or treating Kafka as almost like a household domestic name, and used references to his works based on shared knowledge. So in her, I interviewed her about her prison experience in Kafka, and she told me how in the prison above her lived a man, and she started communicating with him, as was common among prisoners, through a toilet. And she wrote to him, or I will quote her, what she told me. What is there to do in prison? People are idiots, but that's not much news. They entertain themselves by talking through the toilet and by sending letters to each other. Above me was some guy who was my age or maybe older, an intelligent man. And she wanted to test him, and so she wrote, it's in her, how she told me the story. And she wrote to him in her letter, I feel in this dirty, filthy coop like Frida behind the counter in the castle. And he reacted to that. I wanted to test the guy. Here some idiot tries to claim that he is an engineer. By his reaction, he not only let me know that he knew about Kafka, but also the fact that his hint was enough. Kafka's name was not pronounced. It made it clear that this man wasn't pulling my leg in what he was telling me about himself. We corresponded for a long time. We discussed the thing through the use of Frida. He addressed me, dear Frida, with a long I. She also told me in other ways she used Kafka as a code. When she said Kafka had a symbolic value, we knew that he exists, he was a hint. We have another form of communication, and he was perfect for it because one couldn't put you in prison for that. So while distributing Václav Havel's or Ivan Klima's or other writers' work would be punishable, to circulate Kafka in the 1970s and 1980s was not encouraged, but it was not something that could put you in prison. And she also described, okay, I'll just sum this up. She described that, let's say, during distribution of, during meeting and a collaborator coming from the West, they had a code set up where the exchange should have been, she would ask that person in English or German, do you like Franz Kafka? And that person was supposed to say, no, I prefer oranges. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I forgot to say that that person was to stand somewhere with a book by Kafka, holding a book by Kafka somewhere in Prague, and she would come to him, and to make sure that this is the right person, she would say, do you like Franz Kafka? And he was supposed to say, no, I prefer oranges, just to exclude the possibility that this was just some random tourist holding a book by Kafka. So it's I find that, humorous, but an interesting way of using Kafka as a code. And just one really last thing is perhaps to maybe quote Aon Bond, who was a poet and a sort of guru of the Czech underground in the 1970s and 80s. And in a Samizdat film from 1984, he leads, he sort of like enacts like Prague. He's like a flaneur going through various places in Prague. Again, this motif of walking through Kafka's sites. And then he stops in this little square where this memorial is. The only commemorative plaque of Kafka in communist Czechoslovakia that existed. And he narrates, the one whose bust is displayed here on the house where he was born now certainly regrets that he died young and that he is not here with us, because only now he would feel at home here with us. And so my point here is that he doesn't say Kafka's names because, it was a shared, everyone would understand these hints by that period of reception in the normalization Czechoslovakia. I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention, and I would love to hear your comments and questions. Just to make one point is there were more than Shiklova writing about Kafka from prison, but it would go a little bit beyond our scope. Yeah, there was about some Havel as well, for example. Thank you.